If you clicked on this thumbnail, I'm sorry, I couldn't think of anything better to do. I didn't really know how to symbolize the shifting difference in the camera market over the years, so I just made a face. But I want to talk about that, the camera landscape as we wrap up 2024 and we enter 2025. Because from my perspective, and I think the waves are changing a little bit, the landscape is shifting to embracing things that used to be less important, but now are probably the most important. You see, when the DSLR revolution happened back in 2007, 2008, with the 5D Mark II and all the other cameras that came out around that time, basically adding video to photography cameras, there was a lot of focus on things like resolution and bitrate and record run times, continuous recording, and dynamic range was certainly part of that. The sensor size mattered a lot, and your lens and your aperture and how shallow you could shoot. And there was a lot of working around the limitations of the picture profiles, trying to get the most dynamic range because none of us had log profiles back then. And then over the years, these companies making these hybrid style cameras, doing both photo and video, they got smart. They started introducing new features that mattered more and more. Anamorphic support or shutter angle, or you've got things like log that got embraced. And finally, we got 4K in the GH4. And now everyone kind of has 4K, and we're talking about 6K and 8K now. And so when I look forward to next year and the years to come, and I kind of look at what people are commenting online, whether it's on message boards, on Reddit, in the YouTube comments, there's just this shift happening, I think, where people are worried less and less about the specs because, and I've said this before, but most of these cameras do more or less the same kind of stuff when it comes to specs. You've got everybody doing full frame cameras nowadays. I mean, there's some oddballs here and there with like Fuji with their APS-C stuff. But in general, if you want a full frame camera, you can get one quite affordably now, actually. Of course, everyone has 4K and 8K is soon to be probably the new standard. Autofocus for a long time was the sticking point, that Sony's autofocus was just so good, but Nikon, Canon, Lumix, they've all seemingly figured that part of the equation out as well. And you can still debate about who does it better, but they all do it to some degree that's acceptable anyway for video. You've also got IBIS, which was a big new feature on the GH5 back in the day, but now almost all these cameras have decent IBIS. There's certainly better, and I prefer the Lumix IBIS system, but if you need it, it's available on Sony and whoever else is out there doing it. So instead of focusing on those specs, I wanted to kind of talk about what I think is probably more important when you're buying a camera, or just what I think the marketing might end up breaking down to, because there's no escaping the kind of megapixel wars of the past, because even before the DSLR revolution, before hybrid was even a thing, it was all about megapixels, 2 megapixels, 4 megapixels, 8 megapixels. And it was this race to who could have the most megapixels. And we still sort of have that with the R designation on a lot of these cameras, whether it's the Sony R cameras or the Lumix R cameras. More megapixels is useful for photographers in some scenarios, but it's also kind of like the difference between 25 megapixels and 33 megapixels. Does anyone really care? Is that really going to make or break your decision when you go and buy something? Or even like shutter, not shutter angle, but rolling shutter rather, the nature of it. Now we're starting to get cameras with global shutter, and that'll probably become more and more prominent in the industry. But it also comes with some consequences of that global shutter, things like sensitivity, noise, not as optimized for global shutter. But maybe technology will continue to improve, and that's all fine and good. But I think more importantly than all of that is just the general usability of these devices. You see, for me, and the reason that I like to shoot Lumix cameras is because they tend to be the easiest to use. And I don't know if that's bias, if that's just being comfortable with the system for so long, but there's so many things in the Lumix cameras that just make it usable. I've talked about it 1,000 times. I'll talk about it 1,001, but shutter angle is one of those features. I'm not going to dwell on it for too long because if you know about shutter angle, you get it, but it just makes the camera, it makes the device more usable, more user-friendly. I also think things like the user interface are going to start to matter a whole lot more than they ever did in the past. We used to all be comfortable digging through weird, archaic camera menus, and to some degree, we still have to kind of do that. But more importantly, and more often than not, when I pick up a camera, I want it to feel useful and easy to use in a way that I can navigate the menu. The features are called what you'd expect. It's easy to find things. Because if I'm comparing the difference between 6K and 8K, but one is a pain to use and one is super easy to use, I'll go with the 6K one if it just makes my life that much easier. Same thing is true for internal ND filters. By adding those, it just makes the camera more useful, more usable. And I think this comes down to two different things. You've got the hardware features that help make the camera more useful. So the sensor size, if it has internal NDs or anything like that, IBIS, these are all hardware features. They're physical things built into the camera that matter and add. And I think that's where the cost should really come from for the most part when you're buying a device, versus you have the software side, which can also make things useful and usable in terms of the user interface, that the menu, what it's like, the speed in which you can operate the camera. A lot of people complain about when they're just switching between modes, if they're going from video to photo or they're trying to review a photo, just using the camera. Is it quick? Is it responsive? Is it snappy? There's definitely that expectation, I think, nowadays coming from iPhone versus Android, and some of them, just feel a little bit more sluggish. They just feel not quite as responsive as you would want. And I think that's going to be more and more important in the camera industry outside of whatever the specs are. Kind of like, who cares? Yeah, we get that it has IBIS, but is it a pain? Is it a chore? Is it clunky to use? Or is it comfortable? Is it seamless? Is it intuitive? The same is true for the button layout. That's kind of a hardware thing, but it applies to the software side. Are the buttons in the right places? Are they named? Are they labeled the right thing? This has been my biggest problem with the Sony cameras, is that there's buttons on them, but they never seem to be in the right place of where I would want them. And when I look at them, it's C1, C2, C3. They don't really offer up at a glance what the thing even does. And I'm always checking, like, which button does what? What am I doing? And granted, the more you use something, the more comfortable you become using it. But I do think there's a lot of design choices that have been made over the years for photographers, for these photography cameras, that put the buttons in certain places because that's kind of what you need all the time. I'm definitely a fan of the camera that I can do everything in one hand. The moment I have to lift my other hand up to hit the menu button, or, not always hit the review button, maybe that's a sacrifice I'll make. But if I have to hit the menu, lift my left hand to hit the menu, it's just not my preference. I'd rather it all be in one hand so I can hold the camera with one hand and the left hand is just support. It can be on the lens, it can be doing something else. That's a very nitpicky minor gripe, but it's those types of things that I think add up more in the long run in the day-to-day using it, beyond some arbitrary, little feature. Hey, this camera has half a stop extra dynamic range. Well, yeah, maybe that's useful, but is it really all that useful when day to day, week to week, month to month, you're shooting over and over and over again? You're controlling your lighting, you're controlling your set. We've already worked with cameras for so long that have such high limitations that to offer me an extra half a stop of dynamic range, but it comes at some terrible cost of not having X, Y, or Z. Well, that'd be quite frustrating. So I think it all comes down to usability, making the software as snappy, as responsive, as intuitive as possible is ideal. Whether you're Sony, Canon, Nikon, Lumix, I don't care, whoever, the software needs a heavy emphasis, but then also to justify the price point of these devices beyond what a smartphone costs. Because more or less, I guess a smartphone does have hardware, obviously, but it's a lot of the value of a smartphone is on the software side. So if you want to differentiate a camera, a proper photography camera, meaning it has, buttons like a shutter button and it has buttons in the right layout and the hardware is there, maybe something like internal ND filters. Those hardware features matter a whole lot more in 2025 than they did even, 10 years ago, where it was just a box to like capture a picture. And, as long as it got it good enough, we all kind of made it work and we dealt with the rough edges and we hacked it together and you did what you had to do and you made it work. I think in 2025, almost everybody at this point is done making it work, and we want things that make our lives easier. And I think that's what it comes down to: usability, productivity. What leads to productivity? Efficiency. If it's simple, if it's easy, if it's intuitive, all of a sudden, all those things start to click in place, and I'm worried less about the specs. I'm worried less about what it says on the piece of paper, and it's more about what it's like to actually use the thing, which is why in the past and still to this day, I do recommend rent before you buy, try before you buy, somehow get your hands on these things and actually put them past that initial like gut reaction. Because we all have that. The moment you pick up something new and it's kind of foreign, you've never tried it before, you go, oh, I don't really like this. But use it more and more and more, and you can quickly find those little quirks, the little oddities that either surprise you and delight you or that really irritate you and go, oh gosh, I would never use this thing because it does this one thing that's really goofy or really irritating. And a lot of that's personal preference, but I also think there's a lot of, just general standards that at this point, I have cameras that don't have the grip on them. And they sell grips for cameras that don't come with a grip. I think it just makes sense to have a grip on a camera, because it's easier to hold that way. I'm glad they make them without, but it shouldn't be the universal standard that like all of our cameras go gripless. No, in general, it should have a good grip that fits a relatively normal sized hand. I'm sure everyone has different size hands. And certainly that could be your personal preference. If you have big hands or small hands, maybe maybe that will be the selling point for you of what camera is actually the best for you. It has nothing to do with the specs. It has all to do with how it feels in the hand. And some people like the smaller camera, some people like the bigger ones. But I think in general, the more we move towards usability, we can actually start, that's like a new realm of comparison that is harder to quantify, because it's subjective, it's kind of preference. But I think it's actually what creates the stickiness for a brand, for a customer buying the same thing and sticking with a brand. For me, it's been Lumix. I've gotten very comfortable with those cameras. And for whatever reason, they just are very intuitive to me. And I feel like the way they operate makes sense. And every once in a while, I'll find a little quirk or a little oddity of, yeah, that's frustrating. I don't quite like that one thing. But in general, I have way less complaints. It does what I need it to do almost all the time. But I'm also equally, it's equally true that I want to go test the new Nikon and Canon and Sony offerings, because that's really the only way to actually validate that, to know which one feels the best, which one works the best, which one, is snappy, is responsive, gives you what you expect as you're doing it. And you don't run into those like hurdles or roadblocks. For the longest time, and maybe this is still true, maybe it's not, you tell me, but setting a white balance on a Canon camera, a custom white balance, you would have to take a picture and then go into like the review mode and like use it as a custom white balance reference photo. You had to take a picture to use as your white balance. I assume that's still not the case, but if that's still true, that's so clunky, so obtuse, so frustrating, where I think Sony definitely updated to where you just frame up your white balance card, you click a button and it sets your white balance. Same has been true for Lumix for the longest time. There's other quirky things that I found where there's certain cameras don't let you change the white balance during recording. You have to stop and start again. Certain cameras, you can't change other things. Like the Lumix cameras don't let you go into the menu during recording, which I kind of find a little irritating. But these are the fun, really delightful things I like to explore and figure out and go, oh yeah, that's super irritating. I don't care what your resolution is. I don't care how good your autofocus is. If there's this clunkiness built into it, just something basic that limits everything I do for every shoot from here on, count me out. I don't want to add more steps. I don't want to add more complication. I don't want it to be frustrating to use when there are examples of it being done well. And it might come from different brands, different manufacturers. So like I said, I want to test more of this stuff out for myself to really get to know what it's like to use these things. Back not super long ago, but kind of a while now ago, Red cameras, now owned by Nikon, were deemed the best, cinema cameras from a marketing hype perspective. Obviously, Ari has been there at the top of Hollywood for quite a while, but there's still plenty of movies still shot on Red. And here comes along Blackmagic with their cinema camera, and then the Ursa, and then the Ursa Mini. And having shot Red and using an Ursa Mini for the first time, I thought, what a delight. This menu, this interface, this touchscreen actually works in a responsive, snappy way. Now, granted, maybe Red got better over the years, but I remember shooting with the Red Dragon, and before that, the Red Epic. And there was just the touchscreen, everything about it was clunky and slow and sluggish, and stuff was kind of buried in weird spots. The menu layout was not intuitive at all. And then Blackmagic fixed all that with this nice little touchscreen of box interface. Felt revolutionary. Still to this day is one of my favorite menu designs on any camera, because even on the Ursa Mini, the screen was even bigger. The flip-out screen, I think, was larger. Not the Ursa, that had the huge flip-out screen. That thing was crazy. But the Ursa Mini, the first one, had a really nice flip-out screen. Oh, just so great. And, maybe that's true on the new Pixis. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I haven't used that camera. But those are the things that I think matter the most. And I think we should be focused on more. What is it like to use the camera? How much easier does it make your job, your workflow? How much does it speed you up when it takes away that friction of the start-stop of being, chugging along and you're smooth, and then, you hit this awkward button layout, or you hit this weird menu limitation. That's the stuff that really irks me, because at the end of the day, the specs are more or less all the same. Like, who cares about that? We can argue about specs, we can talk about them, but what's it like to actually use the thing? That's the most important. And that's where I see apps, software, and even hardware to some degree, cars. What's it like to drive the thing? They all go 60 miles an hour on the highway. So what's it like to actually drive one? What's the ride like? All these other industries have been around for so long, but I feel like still in digital video, it's still so new. And there's only a handful of companies even competing in this space. So all it would take is one to really just, push a little bit more on the gas in terms of their usability, in terms of their design, their UI, their UX. What's all that like? And the moment you give something that's been properly designed, properly thought out, that meets those expectations or exceeds them, knocks their socks off, you put the camera in someone's hands and it just feels like fun. It feels great in the hand to use it. There's a lot of people who will talk about cameras that are fun to operate and they feel fun, but from my perspective, a lot of it is mostly nostalgic. It's the aesthetic, it's the vibe of it. So something like those Fuji cameras or the Leicas, they look kind of cool. They're kind of novel. The rangefinder design, okay, it's neat. But does it actually feel that good? I don't know. A lot of those cameras I haven't used personally. But for as much as the menus have been redesigned, and for as much as the specs have changed, it still feels more or less the same to use cameras. And maybe that's a good thing. I'm not saying get rid of the stuff that works. There are some good standards that have been built up over the years. The dials, the wheels, the buttons, all that is probably good. We've kind of reached a good point where it's about 5 to 7 buttons, a couple dials, a couple wheels. That's probably pretty good. Where you put the battery, where you put the SD card, it can be moved and massaged, and maybe there's a better way to do it. But what's the hardware that's going to be introduced that's going to actually make my life easier? What's the software that's going to be implemented and refined and tuned to make all of our lives easier and more productive? That's the stuff that gets me most excited. And going into the new year, that's what I'm going to be on the lookout for. Using these cameras to get the most out of them. What does it feel like to use them versus what are the specs? on a piece of paper. Yeah, whatever. Who cares? I want to focus on the stuff that's more important to me.